I need a mother for my daughters, and you need a home. The millionaire proposed to the poor black maid. Grace rose to her feet, suddenly aware of how small she felt in this massive glass mansion overlooking the Malibu coastline. Just an hour ago, 6-year-old Sophie had wrapped her tiny arms around Grace's waist, something the child hadn't done with anyone since her mother's death. The gesture had felt pure, honest. This proposal felt like anything but. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where every path forward would change your life completely? Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. The marble floor was still wet beneath her knees when he offered her everything she couldn't afford. A home, security, and a diamond ring that weighed more than her entire life's possessions. Grace Williams froze, the cleaning cloth dripping onto the expensive floor she'd been scrubbing for the past hour. Her dark eyes lifted slowly to meet Lucas Grant's calculating gaze. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Lucas stood in the doorway of his grand foyer, his tailored suit a stark contrast to her worn uniform. The California sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, turning droplets of cleaning solution into tiny prisms across the marble as Grace's calloused hands rested on the wet surface. "I need a mother for my daughter," he repeated, his deep voice matter of fact. "And you need a home. It's a practical solution." Grace rose to her feet, suddenly aware of how small she felt in this massive glass mansion overlooking the Malibu coastline. Just an hour ago, 6-year-old Sophie had wrapped her tiny arms around Grace's waist, something the child hadn't done with anyone since her mother's death. The gesture had felt pure, honest. This proposal felt like anything but. "Mr. Grant, I'm your maid, not a mail-order bride." She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving damp patches on the worn fabric. His expression didn't change. "This isn't about romance, Ms. Williams. It's about Sophie." The mention of the little girl made Grace pause. In 3 months of cleaning this cold, beautiful house, she'd watched Sophie emerge from her shell, inch by inch. The child who wouldn't speak to anyone now waited for Grace, drawing pictures of them together, asking about Grace's day. "The custody hearing is in 2 months, Lucas continued. "My ex-fiancée is trying to take Sophie from me. She claims I'm cold, unfit, too focused on business." His jaw tightened. "The judge will see a wealthy single father who works too much. Or they could see a stable family home." Grace's mind raced. This man had everything. A tech empire worth hundreds of millions, this stunning ocean view mansion, cars worth more than she'd make in a decade. Yet here he was, offering a ring to the woman who cleaned his toilets. "And what exactly would this arrangement involve?" she asked carefully. "Marriage. Legal adoption of Sophie, if we win. Your own wing of the house. Financial security." He listed these items like business terms. "After 2 years, if you wish to leave, you'll receive a settlement that would set you up comfortably for life." The afternoon light caught the diamond as he extended a small velvet box. "Think of it as a business arrangement with mutual benefits." "I don't sell myself," Grace whispered, rising to her full height. "Not even for a mansion in Malibu." His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something more dangerous, respect. "I'm not buying you, Grace. I'm offering you a partnership. One where we both get exactly what we need." The sound of small feet pattering down the hallway broke their standoff. Sophie appeared, clutching a drawing of 3 stick figures holding hands. "Look what I made, Miss Grace. It's you and me and Daddy." Grace's heart twisted as she looked at the little girl's hopeful eyes, then back at Lucas. For a moment, his mask slipped, revealing not a calculating businessman, but a father desperate to protect his child. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where every path forward would change your life completely? What would you sacrifice for a child who needs you, even if it means binding yourself to someone who sees you as a solution, not a person? Tell me in the comments what choice you would make. She'd spent 28 years learning that nothing comes without a price, especially when offered by a man who could buy anything he wanted except what he needed most. Before you refuse, meet with Sophie's therapist, Lucas said the next morning, sliding a business card across his massive desk. Then decide. Grace hadn't slept. The basement apartment she shared with two other house cleaners felt even smaller after spending days in Lucas's glass palace. The ceiling leaked when it rained, and the landlord ignored their calls. Last month, she'd had to choose between electricity and her asthma medication. But marriage? To her employer? His home office smelled of leather and power, walls lined with books he'd actually read and awards he never mentioned. Through the windows, the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly, a freedom Grace had always craved. "Why me?" she finally asked. "You could hire the best nanny in California. You could find someone from your social circle. I've had 5 nannies quit in the past year. Sophie doesn't trust easily since her mother died." His voice remained neutral, but Grace caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "You're the first person she's connected with." Dr. Melissa Chun confirmed this an hour later in her bright office filled with children's toys. "Sophie has selective mutism triggered by trauma," the therapist explained. "Her mother's plane crash, the media circus afterward. She stopped speaking to almost everyone. But she talks to me," Grace said softly. "More than talks. She trusts you." Dr. Chun leaned forward. "Whatever your relationship is with Mr. Grant, that connection with Sophie is real." The custody papers arrived that afternoon while Grace was folding laundry. Lucas handed them to her without comment. The accusations from Vivian Hunter, Lucas's ex-fiancée, were brutal: emotional neglect, parental alienation, unstable home environment. The woman claimed Sophie called out for her at night, though Grace had never heard the child mention Vivian's name. "She dated me for a year before the engagement," Lucas explained later as they sat in the kitchen. "She met Sophie twice. Now, suddenly she wants custody. What does she really want?" Grace asked. His laugh held no humor. "A convenient path to my assets. Sophie is her leverage." The prenuptial agreement between them looked deceptively small for something that would rewrite both their lives. Grace read every page while Lucas waited, his expensive watch ticking away seconds. The terms were generous: her own bank account, health insurance, college tuition if she wanted it. She'd have complete financial independence. After 2 years, she could leave with a settlement that would fund a comfortable life. "You've thought of everything," she said. "Almost everything." His voice dropped slightly. "There's the matter of making this look authentic." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks as his eyes met hers. For the first time, she allowed herself to really see Lucas Grant as a man, not just an employer. The strong jawline, the intensity in his gray eyes, the subtle cologne that smelled like forests after rain. "Separate bedrooms," she said firmly. "But I have conditions of my own." His eyebrow arched with genuine surprise. "I thought I was the one offering terms." Her smile felt like the first real thing in this glass fortress. "Then you shouldn't have chosen a woman who knows her worth." She listed them clearly. She would have equal say in Sophie's upbringing. She would continue her education. And most importantly, they would present a united front, no undermining each other, especially in front of Sophie. Have you ever made a decision that terrified and thrilled you in equal measure? Drop a red heart if you've ever jumped without knowing where you'd land. The bedroom he gave her was bigger than her entire apartment, but the most shocking luxury wasn't the silk sheets or rainfall shower. It was the lock on her door that actually worked. "This is your space," Lucas explained, standing at a careful distance as Grace took in the cream-colored walls, the reading nook overlooking the ocean, the walk-in closet bigger than her previous kitchen. "No one enters without your permission, not even me." Grace set her worn duffel bag on the bench at the foot of the king-size bed. Everything she owned fit into that single bag: clothes, a few books, the photograph of her grandmother who'd raised her in Birmingham. "The staff has been informed of our engagement," Lucas continued in his efficient way. "They've signed NDAs but expect questions." As if on cue, a sharp knock preceded the appearance of Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper who had supervised Grace just days ago. "I've arranged your clothing selections in the closet, Mrs. Grant," the older woman said, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's still Ms. Williams for now," Grace corrected gently. "And thank you, but I'll organize my own things." Mrs. Reynolds' eyes flickered between them. Very well. Dinner is at 7. After she left, Grace turned to Lucas. That's going to be awkward. She'll adjust. You check his watch. Sophie gets home from school in an hour. She doesn't know about our arrangement yet. Arrangement? The word hung between them, clinical and clear. How should we tell her? Grace asked. For the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. I thought, perhaps you might know better. The mansion sprawled across the cliffside like a modernist dream. All glass and clean lines, overlooking an ocean that changed colors with the sky. But for all its openness, Grace could feel the secrets hiding in plain sight. Family photos with carefully measured spaces between people. A home gym with punching bags that showed heavy use. A mother's absence filled with expensive things. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn, her body still on cleaning job schedule. Unable to sleep, she wandered through the quiet house and found herself drawn to the soft blue light of the infinity pool. She froze at the glass doors. Lucas was cutting through the water with powerful strokes, his muscled back gleaming wet in the pre-dawn light. Grace watched, transfixed, as he reached the edge and pulled himself out in one fluid motion, water streaming down his chest and arms. Heat rushed through her body, a physical reaction she hadn't expected. This man was her employer, her business partner in an arrangement of convenience. Nothing more. She retreated quickly, but not before his eyes lifted and caught her watching. At breakfast, neither mentioned the pool, but something had shifted, a new awareness crackling between them like static electricity. Sophie, however, had no such complications. When told about the engagement over pancakes, she simply nodded and asked, "Does this mean Miss Grace will be here every day, even weekends?" "I'll be living here," Grace explained carefully. "Would that be okay with you?" The little girl's answer was to climb into Grace's lap and continue eating her pancakes as if the matter was settled. Later, as the housekeeper handed Grace fresh towels, her lips thinned. "He's had women before, you know. They never last." Grace met her gaze steadily. "Good thing I'm not here to be his woman. I'm here to be a mother." But the heat lingering on her skin after seeing Lucas in the pool suggested a complication she hadn't planned for. What would you bring with you if you suddenly moved into a world completely different from your own? What piece of your past would you refuse to leave behind? She wore borrowed diamonds and practiced smiles to a charity gala where every whisper analyzed the maid who'd somehow landed California's most eligible widower. "Remember, we met through friends," Lucas reminded her as their driver navigated through Beverly Hills traffic. "Keep it simple, stay close to me." Grace smoothed the midnight blue gown that had arrived that morning from a designer whose name she couldn't pronounce. The dress fit perfectly, as if made for her curves. She tried not to think about how Lucas knew her measurements. "What friends?" she asked. "Shouldn't we have our story straight?" Through Sophie's art therapist, he decided. Plausible, appropriate, explains the connection to Sophie. Grace nodded, adding this fiction to the growing collection of half-truths that now framed her life. 3 weeks ago, she'd been scrubbing toilets. Tonight, she wore a ring worth more than her entire family had ever earned. "One more thing," Lucas said as the car approached the venue. Camera flashes already pulsed through the tinted windows. "We'll need to look convincing." Before she could ask what he meant, his hand covered hers, warm and steady. "May I?" Grace nodded, suddenly breathless as he leaned closer. His lips brushed her cheek, lingering near the corner of her mouth. Not quite a kiss, but intimate enough to make her pulse jump. "Perfume behind the ears and wrists," he murmured, his breath warming her skin. People noticed these details. The ballroom glittered with Hollywood's elite, champagne flutes catching light like liquid stars as camera flashes popped in rhythmic bursts. Grace felt each stare like a physical touch. Some curious, some admiring, most calculating what she could possibly offer a man who had everything. "Lucas, darling." A silver-haired woman in designer couture air-kissed his cheeks. "Finally bringing someone special? It's been ages." "Grace, this is Marion Holbrook, our foundation's biggest donor." Marianne, my fiancée, Grace Williams. Grace extended her hand, remembering the etiquette coach's instructions from yesterday. Lovely to meet you. Charming accent, Marianne said. Alabama, isn't it? How refreshing to have new blood at these events. As the woman moved on, Lucas guided Grace through the crowd with a hand at the small of her back. You're doing fine, he murmured. Each introduction blurred into the next. Tech moguls, entertainment executives, old money and new. Nobody's asking how we met, Grace whispered during a brief moment alone. They're too polite to ask directly, Lucas replied. They'll get their information through gossip channels. The event chair clinked a glass for attention, announcing the opening dance. Lucas turned to her, one eyebrow raised in question. You remember what we practiced? He asked. Yesterday's dancing lesson flashed through Grace's mind, his hand guiding her waist, counting steps in his home office, the strange intimacy of moving together to music. I remember, she said, as they swayed across the dance floor, his hand pressed against her lower back with surprising warmth. You're doing beautifully, he murmured, lips close to her ear. Grace was acutely aware of every point where their bodies connected, his hand at her waist, her palm against his shoulder, the controlled strength in his frame as he guided her through the steps. For a moment, she could almost believe this was real, that she belonged in this glittering world, in this man's arms. The fantasy shattered when a striking blonde in a crimson dress approached, eyes locked on Lucas with familiar intensity. Lucas, darling, she purred. Aren't you going to introduce me to your arrangement? Lucas's body tensed. Vivian, I didn't expect you tonight. Grace knew immediately who this was, the ex-fiancée, the woman threatening to take Sophie away. Vivian Hunter's perfect features arranged themselves into a practiced smile as her eyes assessed Grace from head to toe. So this is your solution? Vivian asked softly. How creative. Have you ever felt like you didn't belong somewhere? How did you handle being the outsider everyone was watching? Share your experience below. The woman who wanted to take Sophie away wasn't a monster. She was beautiful, educated, and the perfect match on paper for Lucas Grant, which made her infinitely more dangerous than Grace had imagined. Vivian Hunter, the blonde, introduced herself, extending a manicured hand. I've heard absolutely nothing about you, which makes you fascinating. Grace accepted the handshake, feeling the subtle assessment in the other woman's grip. Grace Williams, I've heard quite a bit about you. Vivian laughed, the sound like crystal breaking. All terrible, I'm sure. Lucas never did handle rejection well. Actually, Grace said, keeping her voice level, it was Sophie who mentioned you. The flash of surprise in Vivian's eyes confirmed what Grace had suspected. This woman barely knew the child she was fighting to control. Lucas placed a protective hand at Grace's waist. If you'll excuse us, Vivian. Of course. Vivian's smile remained fixed, but I'm sure I'll be seeing more of both of you soon. Vivian Hunter carried herself with the assurance of someone who had never been denied anything important. Her designer heels clicking decisive rhythms across the marble floors as she glided away. She's not what I expected, Grace admitted as Lucas guided her toward the bar. What did you expect? He signaled the bartender. Someone more obviously. Grace hesitated. Evil, Lucas supplied, his mouth quirking slightly. Vivian is calculated. Everything she does serves a purpose, including wanting Sophie. His expression darkened, especially that. The drive home was quiet, the city lights blurring past the window as Grace replayed every interaction from the evening. They had presented a united front, but the cracks were there for anyone looking closely enough. The careful distance they maintained except when being watched, the slight hesitation before touching. You didn't tell me Vivian would be there, Grace finally said. I didn't know. His voice was tight. The foundation specifically didn't invite her. When they arrived home, the babysitter reported that Sophie had gone to bed without incident. Grace checked on the little girl, finding her fast asleep, clutching the stuffed elephant Grace had given her. In the hallway, Lucas had loosened his tie, looking suddenly exhausted beneath the soft lighting. She doesn't want Sophie, Grace said, voice shaking with certainty as Lucas paced. She wants your empire, and that little girl is her ticket. He stopped abruptly, eyes darkening. And what exactly do you want, Grace? The question hung between them, charged with accusation and something far more dangerous, possibility. I want Sophie to be safe, she answered truthfully. I want her to have a childhood not defined by custody battles and adults using her as leverage. And for me, he stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. What do you want from me, Grace? Her heart hammered against her ribs. What did she want from this man who had turned her life upside down, who had offered her security wrapped in complications? Honesty, she finally said. If this arrangement is going to work, I need to know everything. About Vivian, about the custody case, about your past with Sophie's mother. No more surprises. Something shifted in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or relief. My office, he said. There are files you should see. Hours later, surrounded by legal documents and photographs, Grace finally understood the full scope of what she'd stepped into. Vivian's claims about Lucas's parenting, the accusations of emotional neglect, the carefully constructed narrative about the cold, workaholic father. She dated me when my company valuation hit 8 figures, Lucas explained, pouring himself a scotch. The engagement happened when we crossed into 9. She met Sophie twice during our year together. And now, suddenly she wants to be a mother? She wants control of Sophie's trust, he corrected. And by extension, significant influence over my company decisions until Sophie turns 25. When was the last time you stood your ground when someone tried to intimidate you? Did you regret it or feel empowered? Tell me in the comments. The screams echoed through the hallway at 3 a.m. Sophie's nightmares had returned, but this time the little girl called for Grace, not her father. Grace was already moving before fully awake, feet hitting plush carpet as she rushed down the hallway to Sophie's princess-themed bedroom. The child thrashed against pink sheets, tears streaming down her face as she cried out. "Sophie, honey, I'm here." Grace gathered the trembling girl into her arms. "You're safe." "The plane," Sophie whimpered, burying her face against Grace's shoulder. Mommy was in the plane. Moonlight painted silver patterns across Sophie's bedroom as Grace rocked the trembling child, singing soft Alabama lullabies her grandmother had used to chase away darkness. The same songs that had comforted Grace after her parents abandoned her at age 7. "My grandma used to sing this to me," Grace whispered, smoothing Sophie's damp hair. "When I was scared." "Were you scared a lot?" Sophie's voice was small, her breathing calming. "Sometimes. Everyone gets scared, sweet pea." A shadow in the doorway made Grace look up. Lucas stood watching them, his face half hidden in darkness. She couldn't read his expression, but the rigid set of his shoulders told her enough. This was a familiar scene. His daughter's nightmares, his own helplessness to stop them. Grace continued rocking Sophie, the old lullaby filling the spaces where words failed. Eventually, the little girl's breathing deepened into sleep. "She hasn't let anyone comfort her like that," Lucas said quietly as Grace tucked Sophie back under the covers. "Not since her mother. Children sense who feels safe," Grace replied, remembering her own instincts as a child. They moved to the hallway, closing Sophie's door partway. "The therapist says the nightmares might never completely stop," Lucas admitted. His voice held exhaustion and something else. Guilt. "They're worse before court dates. She knows something's happening." Grace leaned against the wall, suddenly aware she was wearing only sleep shorts and a thin tank top. "Children always know. I've tried everything." Lucas ran a hand through his hair, making it stand up in a way that softened his usual polished appearance. "Therapists, meditation, nightlights. But not lullabies?" His smile held no humor. "My skill set doesn't include singing." What did Sophie's mother do when she had nightmares? The question hung between them, intimate in the shadowed hallway. "Eliza Wood." He hesitated, as if the memory caused physical pain. She would make up stories about brave little girls who saved the day. Sophie would fall asleep imagining herself as the hero. It was the first time he'd mentioned his late wife by name, the first crack in the wall he maintained around his past. "Tell me about her," Grace said gently. Lucas looked away. "It's late." We're getting married in 2 weeks, Lucas. On paper, anyway. I should know about the woman who came before me. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the cliffside below. She was a marine biologist, he finally said. We met when my company funded her research. She loved the ocean, rainy days, and terrible action movies. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She was nothing like me, which is probably why it worked. Grace found herself drifting off as Lucas continued talking, the rhythm of his voice soothing. The next thing she knew, she was being lifted, strong arms cradling her against a solid chest. Half asleep, she nestled closer, breathing in Lucas's sandalwood scent. "Thank you," he whispered, voice rough with emotion she'd never heard before. "For being what she needs." Still drifting between dreams and reality, Grace murmured back words that would change everything. "I think we both know I'm starting to be what you need too." She felt his step falter, his arms tightening briefly before he gently placed her on her bed, pulling the covers over her. Through half-closed eyes, she watched him hesitate at her doorway before quietly closing it behind him. What song or memory comforts you when you're afraid? Share something that makes you feel safe when everything feels uncertain. The custody papers arrived on embossed legal stationery, each perfectly typed line a potential weapon against the fragile peace they'd built. They're requesting financial disclosures from both of you. Marcus Benton, Lucas's lead attorney, explained in the conference room. Tax returns, bank statements, employment history. Rain lashed against the office windows as their legal team outlined strategies. The conference room's soft lighting unable to soften the harsh reality of what they faced. Vivian's team had resources, connections, and a narrative about the convenient arrangement that painted Lucas as desperate and Grace as opportunistic. Grace stared at the stack of documents, suddenly feeling the weight of what she'd agreed to. Her tax returns would show her struggle, the cleaning jobs, the periods of unemployment, the tiny income barely covering rent. "We need to address the hasty nature of your engagement," a female attorney said, checking notes. "The timing looks suspicious." "Because it is suspicious," Grace pointed out. Lucas gave her a sharp look. "I mean, that's how the court will see it," she amended. Marcus nodded, "which is why we need to establish that your relationship predates the custody filing. Photos, text messages, anything showing connection prior to the engagement. We don't have those," Lucas said flatly. "Then we need to create a compelling narrative about how your relationship developed," Marcus continued. "Something authentic that explains the acceleration." "You want us to lie," Grace translated. "I want you to emphasize the positive aspects of your relationship," Marcus corrected. "The connection with Sophie, the shared values, the mutual respect." The meeting stretched into evening, strategy piling upon strategy until Grace's head pounded. When the team finally packed up, Lucas remained at the table, reviewing documents with intense focus. "You should get some rest," Grace told him, gathering her notes. "Not yet." He didn't look up. Impulsively, she touched his shoulder. "You won't help Sophie by working yourself to exhaustion." He stilled under her hand, then covered it with his own. The simple contact sent warmth spreading up her arm. "Stay," he said. "Please. I could use another perspective." They worked side by side, shoulders occasionally touching as they reviewed case precedents. Lucas explained legal terms Grace didn't understand, never making her feel ignorant for asking. In turn, she offered insights about Sophie that he sometimes missed, the significance of certain drawings, the meaning behind particular behaviors. Outside, the storm intensified, rain beating against the windows like nature's applause for their efforts. "Thank you," Lucas said during a brief break, "for all of this." The sincerity in his voice made her look up, catching him watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "I'm doing it for Sophie," she said automatically. "Just Sophie?" His voice dropped lower, creating a pocket of intimacy in a large room. Before she could answer, Marcus returned with another attorney, carrying fresh coffee and new concerns. "They've requested your financial history," the lawyer said carefully, eyes on Grace. "All of it." The room fell silent as Lucas looked at her, confusion evident. Is there something I should know? He asked quietly. Grace's heart hammered as she realized her past was about to collide with her present. The bankruptcy after her ex drained their joint account. The check fraud charge when he forged her signature. The mess she'd run from in Alabama. There might be some things that didn't make it into my employment file, she admitted, voice barely audible. Lucas dismissed the attorneys with a gesture, waiting until the door closed behind them. Tell me, he said simply. It might affect the case. Tell me anyway. She took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood at the edge of a cliff. 3 years ago, I was engaged to someone else. He wasn't a good person. When I tried to leave, things got ugly. Legally ugly. Lucas's expression remained neutral, but his knuckles whitened around his pen. Define legally ugly. Have you ever had your character questioned or your intentions doubted? How did you prove yourself when others assumed the worst? I want to hear your stories. She'd spent 3 years rebuilding her life from the wreckage her ex-fiancé left behind. Bankruptcy, a criminal record for a check she never wrote, and a restraining order against the man who'd promised to love her forever. His name was Daniel Carter, Grace said, forcing herself to meet Lucas's eyes across the conference table. We met at the hospital where I worked reception. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and sent flowers just because. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the city skyline. 6 months in, I moved into his apartment. That's when things changed. Her fingers traced invisible patterns on the polished table. First, it was small comments about my clothes, my friends. Then controlling the money made sense, because he was better with finances. By the time I realized what was happening, my name was on loans I never signed for and my friends had stopped calling. Lucas remained silent, his face unreadable in the dim light. When I finally tried to leave, he emptied our joint account. Then checks started bouncing, checks I never wrote. He'd forged my signature. She swallowed hard. The bank pressed charges for fraud. I couldn't prove it wasn't me. You didn't have a lawyer? Lucas asked, his voice carefully neutral. Grace laughed without humor. I couldn't afford bus fare, let alone legal help. My credit was destroyed, my reputation ruined. The only smart thing I did was file for a restraining order after he showed up at my new place. How did you get away? My grandmother's church took up a collection. Enough for a bus ticket to California and 2 weeks' rent. She straightened her shoulders. I started over, cleaning houses, taking any job I could find. No credit check, no questions asked. The home theater had been converted to a war room. Documents covering every surface as Grace pointed to court records projected on the massive screen, her shadow falling across evidence of a past she'd run 3,000 miles to escape. Bankruptcy filing, she explained, advancing to the next slide. Fraud charge that was eventually dropped when the bank decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Restraining order granted after 3 incidents. Lucas studied each document, asking occasional questions with the precision of someone evaluating risk. Grace couldn't read his reaction, whether he was disgusted, disappointed, or merely calculating the damage to his custody case. Vivian's team will use this, he finally said. They'll paint you as financially irresponsible at best, a criminal at worst. I know. Grace's voice was small. If you want to call off our arrangement, I understand. Is that what you think of me? Lucas turned to face her fully. That I'd abandon our agreement because your ex was abusive? The directness of his words, naming what she'd carefully avoided calling abuse, made her throat tighten. Most people hear fraud charge and stop listening. I'm not most people. He moved closer, his voice softening. And I recognize a setup when I see one. This man systematically isolated you, controlled you, then punished you for leaving. Something broke inside Grace, a dam holding back 3 years of shame and anger. Her shoulders shook as tears finally came, hot and fast. Without hesitation, Lucas pulled her into his arms, one hand cradling the back of her head as she cried against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and strong, as he held her. I'm sorry, she whispered, embarrassed by her breakdown. Don't apologize for surviving, he murmured into her hair. His fingers brushed tears from her cheek, lingering against her skin. Why didn't you tell me? he asked, voice low and intimate in the dim light. Grace looked up, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. Because men like you don't marry women with records, Lucas. They hire them to clean their floors. His eyes darkened as he moved closer. I'm starting to think I never really knew men like me at all. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. And worse, she realized she wanted him to. Instead, he stepped back, his expression shifting to determination. We'll get ahead of this, he said. Present the full story ourselves before Vivian can twist it. Marcus has connections with financial crime specialists who can testify about patterns of fraud in domestic abuse cases. Grace stared at him, amazed. You still want to go through with this? Even knowing what Vivian will do with this information. His smile held no warmth, especially knowing that. I've never liked bullies, Grace, and I'm very good at beating them at their own game. Have you ever hidden part of your story out of fear or shame? What would it take for you to share your full truth with someone? Comment below if you've experienced this crossroads. The first time he kissed her wasn't planned in their contract. It happened in the kitchen at midnight over hot chocolate and custody strategies. Crossing a line they'd both pretended didn't exist. Sophie's teacher noticed a change. Grace said, warming milk on the stove. She said Sophie's participating in class discussions again. Lucas sat at the kitchen island, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, looking more approachable than the corporate titan who commanded boardrooms. He'd been reviewing witness preparation notes for their upcoming court date, but his focus had shifted entirely to Grace. You did that, he said quietly. In 6 weeks, you brought her back to life. Grace poured the steaming milk over chocolate, adding a dash of cinnamon. We did it together. Your bedtime stories are the highlight of her day, a skill I'm developing under your coaching. He accepted the mug she offered, their fingers brushing briefly. Moonlight spilled across the kitchen island where spreadsheets and legal briefs lay forgotten, the smell of chocolate and cinnamon hanging in the air as an easy silence settled between them. The lawyers think we should discuss our physical boundaries, Lucas said suddenly. For the hearing, they'll ask about our relationship. Grace nearly choked on her chocolate. What exactly are they expecting us to say? The truth would be ideal. His eyes held hers. That we're still getting to know each other. That our focus has been Sophie. But, Grace prompted, sensing the unspoken concern. But if we appear too distant, it feeds Vivian's narrative about a marriage of convenience. Grace set down her mug. So we need to look like we're... She trailed off, unsure how to finish. Like we're falling in love, Lucas completed softly. The words hung between them, charged with possibilities neither had acknowledged. Outside, the ocean crashed rhythmically against the cliffs below, filling the silence. Are we acting, Lucas? Grace finally asked, voicing the question that had grown increasingly complicated. Is that all this is? He set down his mug and moved around the island until he stood before her, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble on his jaw, smell the lingering traces of his cologne. I think we both know it stopped being an act weeks ago, he said, voice low. The question is what we do about it. His hand lifted to her face, thumb tracing her cheekbone with a gentleness that made her breath catch. May I? Grace nodded, unable to form words as he leaned closer, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips finally met hers, the kiss was tentative, questioning, until she responded, her hands finding his shoulders, then sliding into his hair. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and weeks of building tension converging into something neither had planned for. His arms encircled her waist, lifting her onto the counter as her legs parted to accommodate him. This isn't in our agreement, she gasped as his lips traced the curve of her neck, her fingers threading through his hair, pulling him closer. I'm willing to renegotiate terms, he murmured against her collarbone, hands finding bare skin beneath her nightshirt. Her body arched into his touch, craving more as his mouth returned to hers, the kiss turning hungry, demanding. When his hands skimmed her thighs, she wrapped her legs around his waist, drawing him closer. Grace, he whispered against her mouth, voice ragged. We should stop. What? She could feel his desire pressed against her, his control fraying. Because the first time shouldn't be on a kitchen counter. His forehead rested against hers, breathing uneven. "Because I want to do this right." The respect in his restraint touched her more deeply than his passion had. Slowly, reluctantly, they disentangled, though his hands remained at her waist. "I never expected this," she admitted. "You weren't supposed to be someone I could want." His laugh was soft against her hair. "And you weren't supposed to be someone who could make me feel again." Morning light found them on opposite sides of the house, the night's intimacy replaced by careful distance. The household staff moved efficiently around them at breakfast, pretending not to notice the lingering glances, the new awareness between them. Sophie, however, missed nothing. She looked up from her cereal with unexpected clarity. "Are you my mom for real now, Grace?" The question hung in the air like crystal, fragile, valuable, and potentially shattering. What's more intimate? Letting someone see your vulnerability or showing them your strength? Comment below with your thoughts. She wore a borrowed Chanel suit to the courthouse, but it was the diamond ring she'd finally allowed on her finger that felt heaviest as she swore to tell the whole truth about a marriage that had begun as fiction. The courtroom's polished wood and stern portraits created a theater of judgment. Reporters sketching quick impressions, since cameras weren't allowed, capturing Grace's straight spine and unflinching gaze as Vivian's lawyer approached like a predator scenting weakness. "Ms. Williams," the attorney began, emphasizing her unmarried name despite the ring she wore. "How long had you known Mr. Grant before your engagement?" 3 months, Grace answered honestly. "And during those 3 months, you were employed as his household maid, correct?" "Yes." A rather dramatic change in status, the lawyer noted with a thin smile. From cleaning his bathroom to sharing his bedroom. Lucas's attorney objected immediately, but the implication had been planted. From her seat beside Marcus, Grace could see Vivian's satisfied expression, the calculated sympathy she directed towards Sophie, who sat with the court-appointed guardian. "Ms. Williams, prior to your employment with Mr. Grant, you had how many interactions with his daughter?" "None. Yet now you're asking this court to believe you're qualified to be her mother." Grace met the lawyer's gaze directly. "I'm not asking to replace Sophie's mother. No one could. I'm offering to love her, support her, and provide the stability she needs." Stability? The lawyer consulted his notes with exaggerated care. "Let's discuss your financial history, shall we?" For the next 30 minutes, Grace's past was dissected under fluorescent lights. The bankruptcy, the fraud charge, the restraining order. Each piece presented as evidence of instability rather than survival. "So you've had financial problems, legal problems, and relationship problems," the lawyer summarized. "What exactly do you bring to Sophie's life that Mr. Grant couldn't provide with a qualified nanny?" Grace felt Lucas tense beside her, his hand finding hers under the table, a silent show of support. "I bring understanding," she said quietly. "I know what it's like to lose your mother. I know how it feels when your world falls apart, and the people who should protect you can't. I can't give Sophie designer clothes or fancy vacations, but I can show her how to be strong when life isn't fair." The courtroom fell silent, even Vivian's practiced composure slipping momentarily. When Lucas took the stand, his testimony was precise, controlled, until Vivian's lawyer questioned his motives. "Isn't it true, Mr. Grant, that you proposed this arrangement solely to improve your position in this custody case?" Lucas's jaw tightened. "I asked Grace to marry me because my daughter needs someone who understands her grief, because Sophie connected with her when she wouldn't speak to anyone else, and because I recognized in Grace the kind of strength and compassion I want Sophie to develop. So if this isn't about money, convenience, or legal strategy." The lawyer's skepticism was theatrical. "It's about family," Lucas replied simply. "Something I thought I'd lost forever when my wife died." During the recess, they found a quiet alcove away from curious eyes. Lucas loosened his tie, exhaustion evident in the lines around his eyes. "You were amazing in there," he told her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I just told the truth. Not all of it," he said softly, his fingers intertwined with hers, the simple contact steadying them both. When court resumed, Vivian's lawyer turned smug as he called their final witness. "Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper. Mrs. Reynolds, in your 18 years with the Grant household, have you ever known Mr. Grant to bring romantic interest home? Never. The housekeeper's disapproval was evident, not until Ms. Williams. And would you characterize their relationship as genuine? Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, glancing at Grace and Lucas. I thought it was an arrangement. At first. And now I believe. She straightened her shoulders. I believe Ms. Williams may be the best thing that's happened to that family since Sophie was born. Vivian's lawyer smiled like a shark circling blood. So, Ms. Williams, if this marriage isn't about money, and it isn't about citizenship, and it isn't about Mr. Grant's custody case, Grace cut him off, voice clear despite her racing heart. It's about love. The word hung in the silent courtroom as she turned to find Lucas staring at her with an expression that confirmed what she'd just realized herself. Somewhere between contract signing and court date, truth had replaced pretense. Have you ever had to defend something that began as one thing but became something else entirely? How do you prove feelings that evolved unexpectedly? Share your thoughts below. The photographs hit every tabloid simultaneously. Grace in her maid's uniform, Grace entering her old apartment building, Grace in court during her ex's trial. Each image weaponized to destroy the narrative they'd carefully built. Billionaire's bride. From MAID to millions screamed the headline on Lucas's tablet as they sat in stunned silence at the breakfast table. Sophie was still upstairs getting ready for school, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing. How'd they get these? Grace whispered, scrolling through the vicious article detailing her calculated rise from cleaning staff to future Mrs. Grant. Lucas's expression had gone cold, his CEO mask sliding into place. Someone talked. The employment records, the timing, even quotes from staff. Grace felt physically ill as she read descriptions of herself as ambitious, calculating, and a modern-day Cinderella with questionable motives. Worse were the photos from Daniel's trial, her bruised face partially hidden behind sunglasses as she entered the courthouse. "They're twisting everything," she said, fingers trembling on the screen. "That's what they do." Lucas made a call, his voice clipped as he instructed his PR team to assemble. "We need to get ahead of this." By afternoon, paparazzi gathered at the gates like modern-day vultures. Long lenses pointed toward every window of the glass house that suddenly felt like a display case rather than a sanctuary. The PR team huddled in Lucas's office, debating damage control strategies while Grace paced the bedroom, ignoring her buzzing phone as former colleagues and acquaintances sought insider gossip. When Sophie's school called, reporters had shown up during recess. Lucas dispatched security to bring her home. "Daddy, why are those people taking pictures?" Sophie asked as her bodyguard rushed her through the garage entrance. "They were calling your name at school." Grace knelt before the confused child. "Some people are very interested in other people's business, sweetie. It's not polite, but they do it anyway." Later, after Sophie was distracted with a movie, Lucas found Grace staring out at the ocean, arms wrapped around herself. "I'm sorry," he said, keeping a careful distance. "I should have anticipated this. It's not your fault." "Yes, it is." His voice hardened. "This is my world. I know how it works. I should have protected you both better." Grace turned to face him. "Who do you think sold the story?" "My money's on Vivian. The timing's too perfect." One day after the judge seemed sympathetic to our case. The storm broke that night, both literally and figuratively. Rain lashed against the glass walls as Lucas and Grace argued over next steps, their voices rising above thunder. "I won't have you hide away like you've done something wrong," Lucas insisted. "That feeds their narrative. And parading around pretending everything's fine feeds yours." Grace shot back. "This isn't just about the custody case anymore. They're digging into my past, Lucas. Everything I ran from is being dragged into the light. Then we face it together." His control slipped, raw emotion breaking through. "Stop acting like you're in this alone. Because that's how I've survived." The admission burst from her, unleashing months of carefully contained feelings. "I've always been alone. That's how I know I'll survive this too." Lightning flashed, illuminating the hurt in his eyes. "Is that what you think? That I'd abandon you when things get difficult? Everyone else has. The truth hung between them, fragile and painful. Lucas moved toward her slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal. I'm not everyone else. His hands cupped her face with surprising tenderness, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. When his lips met hers, the kiss was different from their heated kitchen encounter. This was gentle, reassuring, a promise. Grace melted into him, needing his strength as much as he seemed to need her forgiveness. What began as comfort quickly transformed into something more urgent. Hands pulling at clothing, bodies pressing together as if physical connection could shield them from the storm both inside and out. They made love against the bedroom wall, her legs wrapped around his waist, his mouth hot against her neck as thunder crashed around them. The intensity of their connection, born of fear, defiance, and something neither was ready to name, left them breathless, clinging to each other as reality temporarily receded. As they lay tangled in sheets, momentarily sheltered from the storm outside, Lucas's phone lit up with a text from his lawyer. Grace watched his expression harden as he read it. "What is it?" she asked, suddenly cold despite his warmth beside her. "Vivian's filed for emergency custody," he said, voice flat. "She claims our marriage is fraudulent and the environment is harmful to Sophie." What he didn't say hung between them. In the eyes of the law, she was still the maid who'd made an advantageous marriage, and no amount of genuine feeling could erase how their story began. When has your past been used against you? How did you reclaim your narrative when others tried to write your story? I want to hear from you. In the war room at midnight, Grace finally said what everyone had been thinking. What if we end this on our terms before they can tear us apart on theirs? Marcus Benton froze mid-sentence, his legal pad covered with hastily scrawled defense strategies. The team of lawyers exchanged glances as Lucas's head snapped up. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Lucas asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Rain streaked down the windows like tears the adults in the room wouldn't allow themselves. The defense strategy mapped out on whiteboards with clinical precision, a blueprint for dismantling everything they built together. A controlled separation, Grace clarified, presented as a mutual decision to shield Sophie from media attention. A move to one of your other properties temporarily. We show Vivian and the court that Sophie's well-being comes first. That's admitting defeat, Lucas countered. It's tactical retreat, she corrected. Sometimes you have to step back to protect what matters most. Marcus cleared his throat. She may have a point. A voluntary arrangement looks better than a court-ordered one. Out of the question, Lucas dismissed the idea with a wave. We're not separating. After the legal team departed, leaving half-empty coffee cups and discarded strategies in their wake, Grace and Lucas remained in the silent conference room. The space between them felt charged with unspoken fears. "You promised you wouldn't run," Lucas finally said, breaking the silence. "I'm not running. I'm trying to protect Sophie." Grace pushed away from the table. "You saw her face when those photographers called out to her. She's scared, Lucas. And your solution is to break apart the stability we've created to prove Vivian right?" His voice rose with each question. "To walk away the moment things get difficult? That's not fair." Grace felt her own anger rising to match his. "I'm the one whose life is being dissected on every gossip site. I'm the one they're calling a gold digger and worse. And I'm the one they claim bought himself a wife." Lucas slammed his hand against the table. "Do you think I don't see the headlines? The speculation about why a man like me would marry someone like you." The words hung in the air, sharper than he'd intended. "Someone like me," Grace repeated softly. "There it is." Lucas closed his eyes briefly. "That came out wrong, did it? Or is that what you've been thinking all along?" She moved toward the door. Maybe Vivian's right. Maybe this whole thing was a mistake. His hand caught her arm as she passed. "Don't." The single word contained such raw emotion that Grace stopped, turning to face him. "Don't walk away," he continued, voice lower. "Not from this. Not from us." "Is there an us, Lucas?" she challenged. "Beyond the papers we signed? Beyond what's convenient for your custody case?" His hands framed her face, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself again. Not for me, not for Sophie." Grace pulled away, anger flashing through grief. "It's not your decision to make, Lucas." His laugh held no humor. "That's where you're wrong. I didn't bring you into this family to lose you. If you leave this house, I'm coming with you. Empire, reputation, all of it be damned." The declaration hung between them, unexpected and absolute. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "Try me." His eyes held a challenge. "Walk out that door and see if I don't follow." Something shifted in the atmosphere, the anger transforming into a different kind of heat. Grace wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly his mouth was on hers, hungry and demanding. Her back hit the conference room wall as his hands lifted her, her legs wrapping around his waist as if their bodies were picking up the argument their words had abandoned. "I'm not letting you go," he murmured against her throat, hands sliding beneath her blouse. "I'm not yours to keep," she gasped, even as her body arched into his touch. Their lovemaking was different this time. A battle for control, for truth, for something neither would name. When they finally broke apart, breathing hard, clothes disheveled, the rain had stopped outside, leaving an eerie quiet. "You're right," Lucas said unexpectedly, straightening his shirt. "About creating distance to protect Sophie." Grace stilled, her heart sinking. "You're agreeing with me now? Not the way you think." He reached for her hand. "I have a property in Carmel. Private, gated, with its own security. We'll go there. All three of us. Remove Sophie from the spotlight while maintaining our family unit. Run away together?" The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Not running, regrouping. His eyes held hers. "Together, would you walk away from something real to protect someone you love? Have you ever had to choose between your heart and what seemed right?" Share your experience in the comments. The last person Grace expected to see in Lucas's study was her former neighbor. The retired nurse who'd hidden Grace in her apartment when the bruises were too obvious to explain away. "Miss Cecilia?" Grace stopped in the doorway, convinced she was hallucinating. Miss Cecilia Jackson sat ramrod straight despite her 73 years. Her nurse's scrubs replaced by a proper church suit. Hands folded over a weathered leather purse containing photographs that could change everything. Evidence of who Grace had been and who she had fought to become. "Hello, sweet girl." The older woman's warm Alabama accent filled the room like sunshine. "Your man here sent for me." Grace turned questioning eyes to Lucas, who stood by the window with an unreadable expression. "Ms. Jackson has agreed to testify at our hearing," he explained, "as a character witness." "I don't understand." Grace moved into the room slowly. "How did you even find her?" "Your grandmother's church." Lucas's voice softened. "I had my team track down everyone who might have known you before California." The coastal property in Carmel had become their sanctuary for the past week. A sprawling beach house tucked behind high walls and security gates, far from the media frenzy in Malibu. Sophie had thrived in the relaxed atmosphere, her nightmares subsiding as she spent days collecting shells and building sandcastles. Grace had begun to hope they might weather the storm after all, until Lucas announced they needed to return for the emergency custody hearing. "Come sit." Cecilia patted the sofa beside her. "Tell me how you've been keeping yourself." As Grace settled next to her former neighbor, memories flooded back. Nights spent on Cecilia's worn couch after Daniel's rages, the older woman applying ice to bruises while humming gospel songs, teaching Grace that surviving wasn't the same as living. "I've been good," Grace said truthfully. "Better than I ever thought possible." "I can see that." Cecilia's knowing eyes took in the elegant surroundings, the subtle changes in Grace's posture and confidence. "This man of yours called me 3 days ago. Said you needed someone who knew your heart before all this." She gestured around the room. "And you flew across the country?" "Child, I've been praying for this day since you slipped away on that bus." Cecilia's weathered hand squeezed hers. "To see you found your strength. And someone worthy of it." For the next 2 hours, Cecilia shared her testimony with the legal team. How she'd watched Grace rebuild herself after each of Daniel's attacks. How Grace had volunteered at the hospital despite her own troubles. how she tutored neighborhood children in reading. She always had a way with little ones, Cecilia told Marcus. Even at her lowest, she'd read stories to my grandkids when they visited, made different voices for all the characters. Lucas listened intently, occasionally catching Grace's eye across the room with a look that made her heart stumble. "There's something else," Cecilia said as the lawyers prepared to leave. "Something that woman using the child as a weapon should know." From her purse, she withdrew a small envelope of photographs. "I kept these," she explained to Grace, "from her time volunteering in the NICU." The pictures showed a younger Grace holding tiny premature babies, her expression gentle as she cradled the fragile infants while their parents couldn't be present. 300 hours, Cecilia announced. That's how many she gave to those babies, holding them, talking to them when their own families couldn't be there. The nurses called her the baby whisperer. Grace felt tears threatening as Lucas examined the photos, his fingers tracing her image with unexpected tenderness. "Thank you," he told Cecilia quietly, "for bringing these, for coming. You take care of her," the older woman responded, her voice suddenly stern. "She's had enough men who couldn't measure up." As Cecilia prepared to leave, she pressed something into Grace's palm, a faded Polaroid of Grace holding infant twins in the hospital nursery. "You were always meant to be a mother, child," she whispered. "I kept this all these years waiting for when you were ready to remember." Lucas's sharp intake of breath matched Grace's own as she stared at the evidence of the children she'd never told him about. The final piece of her past she'd locked away, even from herself. The twins' faces were barely visible among the medical equipment, their tiny hands clutching Grace's fingers through incubator openings. The date stamp showed 3 years ago, the week before she'd fled Alabama. Grace couldn't finish, the words catching in her throat. "Not now," Cecilia advised, glancing at Lucas's confused expression. "But soon. He deserves to know all of you, not just the parts you think are safe to share. Who has been your unexpected champion when you needed one most? Tag someone who stood up for you when you couldn't stand up for yourself." The twins would have been 8 years old enough for school pictures, missing teeth, and questions about why the sky is blue, if the car accident hadn't taken them along with Grace's ability to ever have children again. Dawn broke over the ocean as they sat on the beach, shoes discarded, the tide washing away footprints as Grace finally released the grief she'd carried silently for years, words spilling out like shells being returned to the sea. "They weren't mine," she began, watching the horizon lighten. "Not biologically. They belonged to my cousin Lisa." Lucas remained silent beside her, giving her space to find the words that had remained unspoken for so long. "Lisa got pregnant at 17. Her parents wanted her to give the babies up, but she refused. I was 23, working at the hospital. I offered to help her raise them." Grace dug her toes into the cool sand. "We became a team, Lisa, the twins, and me." The memory of tiny faces with identical button noses made her smile despite the pain. Lily and Lucas. That was their names. Lucas's hand found hers in the sand, fingers intertwining. "I didn't realize until just now, your name. That's why it felt familiar when we met." Grace shook her head at the coincidence. Little Lucas had the same stubborn expression you get when you're thinking. "What happened?" Lucas asked softly. Grace took a deep breath. "When the twins were 2, Lisa met Daniel. He seemed perfect at first, attentive, responsible. He moved in with us, played daddy. I should have seen the warning signs." The rising sun cast long shadows across the beach as Grace described how Daniel had gradually isolated Lisa from friends and family, how his charming mask slipped when the babies cried, how Grace had become increasingly concerned. "Lisa and I had a fight about him. I told her he scared me, the way he'd get quiet when he was angry. She accused me of being jealous." Grace's voice caught. "I moved out. The worst mistake of my life." Lucas's grip tightened on her hand as she continued. 6 months later, Lisa called me hysterical. Daniel had hit her. I went to get her and the twins immediately. Grace stared at the waves. We were driving back to my place when a truck ran a red light, hit us on the passenger side. The memory of screeching metal and shattering glass made her voice falter. Lisa died instantly. The twins, they were in their car seats behind her. The doctors tried, but she couldn't finish. And you? Lucas asked gently. Ruptured spleen, collapsed lung, pelvic fractures. 3 weeks in hospital. 8 surgeries. Her hand unconsciously moved to her abdomen. The internal damage was extensive. No chance of children. The medical terms felt safer than describing the emotional devastation. Waking up to learn she'd lost everything, including her future as a mother. Daniel showed up at the hospital, claimed I'd kidnapped Lisa and the twins. But the accident was my fault. Her voice hardened. That's when the abuse allegations began, the financial fraud, everything. He wanted someone to blame. I was convenient. Lucas remained quiet for a long moment. And no one believed you? Some did. Cecilia, my grandmother. But the police had Daniel's statement, the neighbors who'd seen our fight. It was easier to believe I was unstable than to investigate a grieving fiancé. So you ran. Grace nodded. Once I could walk again, left everything behind. Lucas turned to face her fully. Why didn't you tell me this before? When I proposed our arrangement, how exactly would that conversation go? Grace gave a hollow laugh. Hi, I'm your maid. I'd love to be your fake wife and mother to your child. By the way, I'm barren, and the last children I loved died while I was driving. You weren't responsible for that accident, Lucas said firmly. My head knows that. My heart. She shrugged. I see their faces every time I close my eyes. Is that why you connected with Sophie? Because of the twins. Grace considered this. Maybe at first. We recognized each other's grief. But Sophie is Sophie, her own person. I love her for who she is. And me? Lucas asked quietly. Where do I fit in this story? The question hung between them as the sun fully emerged above the horizon, painting the sky in pinks and golds. You were supposed to be temporary, Grace admitted. A means to an end. A way to help Sophie while helping myself. And now you're the man who sent private investigators across the country to find an elderly nurse who could vouch for me. The man who looks at me like he sees something worth fighting for. Her voice softened. The man I'm falling in love with against every rational instinct I have. The confession hung in the morning air between them. Lucas reached for her, pulling her into his arms as the tide crept closer to their feet. Come home with me, he whispered against her hair. That night, in their bedroom overlooking the moonlit ocean, Lucas undressed her with reverence, kissing each scar the accident had left. Not just the visible ones across her abdomen, but the invisible ones that had shaped her heart. You're still whole, he whispered against her skin. You've always been whole. For the first time, she believed him. As morning light filtered through the bedroom windows, Lucas's phone rang with news that changed everything. Vivian had been photographed meeting with a private investigator who'd leaked Grace's past, proving a conspiracy that violated multiple court orders. The final hearing was moved up to tomorrow. We have one chance, their lawyer said. Are you ready to fight for your family? The question wasn't just legal strategy. It was the definition of everything they become. How do you heal from losses that seem impossible to overcome? What parts of your story have you kept hidden from those closest to you? Share if you're comfortable. The judge asked her to describe her relationship with Lucas Grant, billion-dollar businessman, devoted father, and the man who once paid her to scrub his floors. And for the first time since entering his glass mansion, Grace didn't measure a single word. When I met Lucas Grant, she began, her voice steady in the hushed courtroom. I was cleaning his house while Sophie hid in corners and Lucas buried himself in work. There were two people drowning in grief, living in the same space but completely alone. Afternoon light streamed through the courtroom's high windows, illuminating particles of dust that danced like stars as Grace stood in the witness box, no longer borrowing confidence or designer clothes. Her strength now came from within. Understand loss, she continued, meeting Vivian's cold stare across the room. I've survived things that should have broken me. That's how I recognized what was happening in that house. Two survivors who'd forgotten how to live. The evidence against Vivian had been damning. Phone records connecting her to the tabloid leaks, bank transfers to the private investigator, even emails outlining her strategy to use Sophie as leverage for financial gain. But the judge had still requested final statements from both Grace and Lucas. Ms. Hunter claims I married Lucas for money and security, Grace acknowledged. And in the beginning, there was truth to that. I needed a home. Sophie needed a mother. Lucas needed to protect his daughter. We made an arrangement. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lucas's eyes never left her face. But arrangements evolve into attachments. Attachments deepen into bonds. And sometimes, when you're not looking for it, bonds transform into love. Grace's voice softened. Not the dramatic kind from movies. The quiet kind that shows up in lunchboxes with handwritten notes. In bedtime stories read in different voices. In holding someone through nightmares about plane crashes. She watched the judge's expression carefully. This woman who held their family's future in her hands. I can't have biological children, Grace stated plainly. An accident took that from me, along with people I loved. I thought that meant I'd never be a mother. Then I met Sophie, this brilliant, wounded child who taught me that family isn't about whose blood you carry, but whose heart you hold. The courtroom remained silent as she continued. As for my relationship with Lucas, she looked directly at him, at the man who had evolved from employer to partner to the love she never expected. It started as a contract, but you can't schedule when someone becomes essential to your life. You can't plan when their smile becomes the thing you look forward to most. You can't sign paperwork that explains how it feels when they see all your broken pieces and still choose you every day. When Grace finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom, except for Vivian's, whose fury was barely contained behind her perfect makeup. Lucas's testimony was shorter but equally powerful. 3 years ago, I lost my wife and nearly lost myself, he said, his usual corporate polish replaced by raw honesty. I built walls around Sophie and me, thinking I was protecting us. Instead, I was burying us alive. He described how Grace had brought light back into their home. Not through grand gestures, but through consistency and care. The arrangement we initially discussed was my idea, he admitted. A solution to a problem. What I didn't anticipate was falling in love with her strength, her integrity, her capacity for joy despite everything she's endured. The judge's ruling came swiftly. Custody remained with Lucas, with Vivian's visitation rights severely restricted and supervised. The restraining order against her contacting Grace was granted immediately. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as they made their way to the waiting car. Lucas kept his arm firmly around Grace's waist. Sophie held securely in his other arm. Mr. Grant, is your marriage real or just for custody? Lucas paused at the car door, looking at the sea of cameras. Our beginning was unconventional, he acknowledged. But I challenge anyone to find a love more real than what we've built together. Once safely inside the car, Sophie curled against Grace's side. Does this mean the bad lady can't take me away? That's exactly what it means, sweet pea, Grace assured her, stroking her hair. And you're staying forever? The child's eyes held lingering worry. Forever and always, Grace promised. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep, Lucas found Grace on the balcony overlooking the ocean. Without a word, he handed her a small blue box. We've done this backwards, he said as she opened it to find a new ring. Not the arrangement ring she'd been wearing, but a unique sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. I thought you deserved a proper proposal. One based on choice, not necessity. Grace touched the ring with trembling fingers. Are you sure? Your world is complicated enough without. My world makes sense now, he interrupted. Because of you. Because of us. 3 months later, on the cliffside lawn of the home that now truly belonged to all of them, Sophie twirled in a flower girl dress as Grace and Lucas exchanged vows for the second time. Not for courts or cameras or custody, but for themselves. Cecilia sat in the front row, beaming approval. Mrs. Reynolds, who now addressed Grace with genuine respect, supervised the catering staff. Even Marcus had abandoned his legal pad for champagne. Some might say we did everything backwards, Lucas said, sliding the sapphire ring onto her finger. But I wouldn't change a single step that brought us here. Grace looked out at the gathered witnesses, Cecilia nodding approval, Sophie beaming. even the household staff who had watched their story unfold day by day. "The best journeys aren't about the destination," she replied, words meant only for him despite the microphone between them. "They're about who walks beside you when the path gets rough." What unexpected journey has completely transformed your life? What relationship began one way and became something entirely different? Share your story of transformation below.